It's just not possible to gain that much in value that quickly with declining revenue.
And that's when I really had the epiphany that investing was not about stocks and bonds. Investing is about innovation.
The belief is if there's a new piece of information, that it will be instantly incorporated into the price of the stock or the bond or whatever. But that's not how people change their minds.
Welcome back. I'm Hayden Brain, and you're listening to Opto Sessions, where we interview the top traders and investors from around the world, uncovering their secrets to success. Jeff is the editor-in-chief of Visual Capitalist, frequently featured on Business Insider, Forbes, CNBC, MarketWatch, the Huffington Post, and the World Economic Forum. A staggering 2.5 exabytes of data is generated every day, making our world increasingly difficult to understand. By exposing the bigger picture through data-driven infographics, Visual Capitalists help readers cut through that clutter and simplify a complex world. I spoke to Jeff about his new book, Signals, the 27 Trends Defining the Future of the Global Economy. The book draws on the oceans of data we're all surrounded by to extract insights about where the world is headed, from society and demographics to tech innovation. In today's episode, we focus on the socioeconomic trends governing the near 8 billion people on this planet. Enjoy. Welcome, Jeff. It's great to have you on the show. So how's your week been so far? What have you been up to?
Yeah, no, it's been great. Just catching up. We were actually in Mexico for 10 days and then in New York next week. So it's a bit of a grind this week to try and catch up and also prepare for next week. But yeah, all is well.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay, so today the focus of the interview will of course be your new book, Signals, the 27 Trends Defining the Future of the Global Economy. So I want to dig into that briefly just to kind of introduce the subject matter to the listeners, and then we'll circle back. We'll cover exactly kind of who Visual Capitalists are for anyone that doesn't know, and then we'll dig into the book and some of the themes within it. So amongst those 27 trends that you've established in the work that you've done for the book, I just wondered whether there was any kind of overarching trends or mega trends even that help group them together, just to make it a little bit less abstract for the listeners.
Yeah, and it's funny because, I don't think that we set off on the mission of saying, hey, we're only going to cover, or we're going to focus in on these specific topics or anything like that. But really, when you take all of the different data sets that we were looking at and really categorize them by, where is there going to be a clear impact that, it's really hard to, it's something that it is hard to debate. When you start going through those, really you start to notice these trends amongst what you have. And so an obvious one is something like technology, where you can see, out of the 27 trends that we have, probably 6 or 7 of them are directly related to technology, but probably 10 to 15 of them are indirectly related to technology, because it's such a, it creates so much acceleration in how fast things change. But yeah, when you break it down, we ended up categorizing into 7 different categories. We have obviously technology is one of them, and we also have another topic that's related to that, which is just the digital world. We have the geopolitical realm, we have demographics and society, we have the financial aspect of things as well. We also have environment, which is an area that is front and center today as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And in reading the book, it just sort of struck me how much data you've got there. I mean, the volume of data that you're trying to sift through and make sense of is pretty colossal. But where do you get all that data from, or kind of more pertinently, how do you make sure, I guess, that the sources of the data are credible and accurate?
Yeah, so we've been doing this for a while now. So we have a variety of sources that we go back to from time to time. It helps to have a, sort of a map of where you can get data from. For the most part, though, we typically divide things into a couple of main categories for where we source data. So the first one is government and sort of international sources. So that would include things like the World Bank or the IMF, or other sources like that your listeners would probably be aware of. I mean, they have massive databases with all kinds of data in them. They publish reports each year where they do deep dives on some of these topics as well. So they're obviously a great resource. They're just there's just so much there that you have to be able to know what you're looking for, or you have to be able to sift through it. The second really good source that we use a lot is from different consulting and like management consulting and the Big Four accountants and groups like that. If you're getting something from a McKinsey or if you're getting it from a PwC, usually they have very good people working on it. They tend not to be too biased, at least in our opinion, from what we've seen, and they tend to be really robust data sets. And then, of course, there's think tanks and things like that too. They tend to be a little bit trickier because they tend to have a political view. And we're always trying to try to keep things pretty neutral, and to look at data and to say, yeah, I think that this is, this has no spin applied to it or things like that. So there's a bunch of sort of meta things that you have to keep in mind. But yeah, those two sources are really they drive the bulk of the work.
Yeah, fantastic. So I think now would be a good juncture to sort of introduce Visual Capitalist to anyone that isn't aware of the work that you do. So perhaps you could sum up the publisher's sort of mission statement. What's your main aim?
Yeah, so our mission is to make data more accessible to people. And so we do this by using data visualization and data storytelling. So, obviously there's tons of data out there, and it's quite as we cover in Signals, it's quite a bewildering universe to the average person. There's data that conflicts with one another. There's data that is skewed. There's data that is biased or presented in a biased way. And there's just lots of it. So what Visual Capitalist tries to do is we try to take the trends and the things that we think are important. We try to visualize them in a way that's memorable and shareable and that people can look at, and hopefully through that visual aspect, which about 65% of people are visual learners, to be able to look at something and get something out of it is really the key. And so the other thing that we think a lot about with all of this as well is, it's not only about making data more accessible to people, but it's also about how can we make it so that the vast across the world, how can everybody have access to this data? How can everybody be able to know the things that we know and take for granted? There's people in countries around the world that might not have the same literacy with data. They might not have the same access to it. And so one of the things that we're trying to do is we're trying to, evangelize the way that we are presenting the data, but also B, how can we make it as accessible as possible and get out to as many people?
Yeah, absolutely. And it certainly comes across on your website. I think then the follow-up question I've got is more in relation to Signals, which is obviously the subject of the book, but I think relevant to kind of the broader work that you do. How or why then, more than ever, is it so difficult to discern, proper informative signals that give an investor or just anyone value versus noise? How do we separate signals from noise?
So I think that that's obviously a bit of a personal question, depending on who the person is and what they're trying, what they're after. For us, what we were looking at was, in terms of creating a book that can serve as a foundation for almost anybody in a professional pursuit or an investor with their portfolio. What are the things that are not up for debate in terms of how the world is changing? That was really the lens that we were looking through. How can you show something that is occurring right now and that's going to continue to occur, that you need to know, but also that, again, it doesn't have it's not a hot take, it's not a prediction, it's not our opinion that this trend is going to be big. It's something that's clear through the data that is happening and it's going to continue to happen. And this is going to affect the world. And if you are allocating capital, if you are trying to move to your dream job in 10 years, if you are trying to go somewhere, this is something that you need to know and something that is going to impact you. And so that is the lens that we were looking through. And as we were evaluating the different data sets, I mean, of course, you find all kinds of really cool trends and super interesting things happening. But again, the lens that we're looking through is this going to impact people? Is this something that is, not up for debate? And to be honest, there are a lot of things that are up for debate, right? I mean, if you look at any set of data, there's always a counter example, or there's always, some other argument to be made. And that's what makes markets. So that's great, right? But now I have a better understanding, and now you can start to make those judgment calls of what areas you want to dive deeper into, or what areas maybe that you can find some disagreement with, or you can look at it in a different way, or have that sort of a contrarian view on.
Yeah. Okay. So why is that difficult now more than ever? What's contributing to that noise? Who are the kind of key perpetrators to that noise, as it were?
Right. So why is there so much noise out there? For me, the biggest thing, data is actually, the amount of data that exists is doubling every 2 to 3 years. So that's, some of that's going to be like a random sensor picking up data somewhere, but also that's data that's published, data that's available to people, and resources that people are looking at. It's different opinions. And of course, the barriers to entry for creating data are lower than ever, right? Anybody can go and publish information. They can publish their take, they can set data. So you have different data sources, you have different analyses of these sources that lead to different opinions. And so the world is just much more complicated and complex now, where you have so many different opinions filtering in on what is meaningful. I think that these are really the biggest factors, but also when you look at this stuff, there's only just so much that we can handle mentally, right? Humans have evolved in a certain way, in a very linear way. And when you have mountains and mountains of data growing exponentially, and you're hit from every angle with all of these data points, it makes it harder to have resolve sometimes, because you have analysis paralysis, where you have just too much data and you can't form an opinion on it, or you have something that you feel like, for example, from an investing point of view, maybe you have something that you have some conviction about, but then you start to see all these different data sources that are conflicting with your point of view, because there just is that much more data out there. And so it actually makes it harder to make decisions a lot of the time, even though data is supposed to be our friend. It's supposed to be something that helps us make better decisions. I just find that it also can be very muddying, or sometimes you're getting the completely inverse point of view from data. So it really is something. It's a tool that you have to know how to use, and a tool that you have to be able to make the most of.
Yeah, absolutely. Completely agree. And no doubt that's something our listeners will have contended with over the past few years for sure. So let's move on then to defining, I guess, what a signal is, how exactly you define a signal and determine whether something is actually worth paying attention to. Is there kind of a top level answer you can give me as to how you determine that?
Yeah, so I think the most important thing is obviously it's something that is going to have a wide ranging effect on society and markets as a whole.
Yep.
Of course, there are many smaller, tinier signals that we didn't include in the book that are much more concentrated in one area, or that relates to some very niche market or something like that. But in the book, we tried to cover the ones that are going to have wide ranging impacts, all over the world, that are going to be rippling in a number of different sectors, and that you will notice the impact of, regardless of what your discipline is and where you focus. Something like an aging population, or interest rates, or globalization. These are all things that relate, sort of to everything.
Yeah.
So that's really the first criteria. The second criteria is we wanted to focus in on things that have been happening for a notable amount of time, and numerous sources are predicting will continue to happen along that same trend. So when we put together the book, something like cryptocurrency, we would have loved to include in the book, but we didn't see enough, because it's so up and down, and it's so it's such a tricky thing to encapsulate in one trend. it's something that didn't meet that criteria, even though I think it's super interesting. And, we've covered it for a long time. It didn't meet that criteria in the book. So really something that's been happening for a long time and will continue to happen is the next thing. And then the third thing is we were looking at, we have a formula throughout the book, which I think we'll be going into, but we're trying to show not only how that signal formed, but also what its impacts are going to be. So we wanted to be able to cover different impacts that signal would be leading towards, and not that that's a comprehensive thing, but it allows you to point out some specific examples of, hey, here's this signal in practice, and a couple areas where you're starting to see the big impact it will have, and that can help. That helps provide some tangible aspect to the reader, such that they can look at this, maybe very macro type signal, and they can start to see what the actual impacts are going to be.
Yeah, okay. So I guess once you've identified the signals that you want to look at, there's a bit of a job to work out which ones are going to have the most socioeconomic impact, I suppose. How do you gauge that?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is, what areas does this affect, right? So obviously, when you're looking at something that's very niche, it's going to probably impact one or two areas of society. And then when you're looking at something that has more wide-ranging impact, you can say it starts to become pretty clear right away, right? Like, this is going to not only impact financial markets, but it's also going to impact how how the makeup of society is. It's also going to impact how business decision makers need to make decisions, and you start to see across the board, okay, this is something that is going to be wide ranging, and it's going to affect how people do business and how markets work all over the world. So we're really trying to just see, is something wide ranging enough that it could be covered in the book, or is it something that is going to be very concentrated? And that doesn't mean it's not important. It just means that it's important to fewer people, right? And so therefore it doesn't fall within the scope of the book.
Got it. And within the book, you kind of reference a signal to noise ratio. So to give, I guess, a top line indicator of how impactful that signal is versus the noise out there. I think one of the themes I looked at was, 5. Which was the highest number available, which meant to me that it was obviously very impactful. But perhaps you could explain a little bit more about what that means.
Yeah, so we have 2 measures that we've included for each signal in the book. And to be very clear, like, while the book is very quantitative, built throughout, and there's obviously tons of data, these 2 measures were our own sort of arbitrary measures, and they were done in a way that I think we can't say is as quantitative as the rest of the book. It was a bit more of a feel of like, okay, we're looking at something like the proliferation of 5G. So the 2 things that we looked at is, what is the signal range, like what is the strength, and how wide ranging is this impact going to be? So 5G, you think about what that is going to affect. Okay, well, that's going to be, faster internet speeds in mobile in like a really dramatic way all around the world, which is going to impact, all of these different areas. So, okay, so you get a sense of what that is. But then the one that you referenced, which is signal to noise, this is a measure that we had because, data out there on these things is not perfect. And sometimes you find that there are, as we were talking about before, conflicting opinions on things, or there are different data sets that might not align with the signal. And so in some situations, we gave a score of 5, as you mentioned, where we're like, okay, I haven't seen anything that contradicts this at all. Like, this is happening, it's guaranteed, right? And then in other ones, you think, okay, almost everything that we've seen, and obviously this is a criteria for the book, so we made sure it met a minimum amount of signal to noise. But also you look at it and you say, maybe there's some room here for, maybe we're it's not as clear that this signal is going to continue happening in the future, because there are some things there are some signs or some early data that are pointing in other ways, or maybe it's going to go, more sideways than it's going to go straight and up or something like that. So
Sure.
we want to, we want to share that uncertainty with people, because at the end of the day, I mean, none of this stuff is a guarantee, right? As we saw, we published the book during we started publishing the book during the start of the pandemic, basically. That's when we started researching for it. So at that time, nothing was guaranteed, right? We were trying to figure out the signals at the same time as, no one knew what was happening. So it was an interesting exercise to go through. And as I say, I think that there's very good data backing up all of these signals, but at the same time, I think it's intellectually dishonest to say that, all of these things are happening for sure. And there's no counter evidence to some of them. And so that's what we tried to represent with the signal to noise ratio.
Okay, perfect. Well, I think that's a good juncture then to start getting into at least one of the 7 sort of overarching themes within the book. I thought I'd go with the society and demographics theme, just given its sort of pervasiveness and hopefully its ability to set the context for the rest of the book. What then, first of all, or kind of where do you start trying to make sense of trends governing the societal and demographical shifts of the near 8 billion people on this planet? I was just interested to kind of get an insight into your kind of thought process and mindset about how you tackle such a colossal task.
Well, yeah, I mean, as the quote goes, right, demographics is destiny. And so this is something that when you're looking at macro factors that really impact everything, whether it's markets or business or society or culture or any of these things. I mean, demographics, there isn't a better example than that, right? So what we were thinking of when we looked at it are from a super macro point of view, how is society made up? And not in terms of more subjective things, but like where do people live? How are they living? What age are people? What are the trends of those ages? Are they living longer or shorter? What is the distribution of those people, and why does that matter? So basically looking at any factors that derive from how people are living and how that's changing. And obviously, if you have a trend that is affecting 8 billion people and they're, for example, all getting wealthier or all getting older, or they're, any of these things, that's going to have a giant ripple effect across markets in the economy. And these are the things that are really worth knowing and worth understanding in a deeper way. And so, yeah, we were looking at that really big picture of the world as a whole, not of individual countries or continents as much. Like, we wanted to look at it globally and in the most macro lens possible.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. It felt global rather than sort of US centric, which obviously a lot of these kind of reports and things tend to feel. So one of the sub-themes within society and demographics was longevity, so an aging global population. So let's dig into that first. So I think that this infographic straight away just gives you an idea of kind of where the population is at in terms of how quickly it's aging. You can see right from 1970 through to 2090 that we're growing at a pretty stable and kind of consistent rate in terms of that aging population getting higher and higher. Perhaps you can just talk us through this slide, let us know what's happening here, and I think it sets the context for the rest of the section.
Absolutely. So the most important thing I think about this, I actually love this from as an entry chapter to the book and as a concept of a signal overall. So this is like one of the clearest signals you could ever come across, simply because it's been happening since 1970 till now. It's projected by everybody to continue happening for the next 80 years. So an aging world is here. It's It's one of the clearest things that we can come up with as an example of a signal that, there's no counter evidence to it or anything like that. Like, this is happening and it's going to impact the world and all of global markets, and everything from government incomes to, government fiscal policy to how we invest is all going to be affected by this. But yes, in terms of this slide, what you see here is basically that the median age, is going from in 1970, if you looked around the world, even in developing economies, people were really young. But if you fast forward to now, the median age already in Europe, in a lot of places, is in the 40s. In North America, it's a little bit younger in the US, but it's in the 30s and getting into the 40s. And then there are, of course, pockets where median age is really low. In Africa, for example, there's the median age was 18 just a year or two ago, which is pretty mind-boggling when you think of what that population distribution looks like for that continent. But what's really clear here is that median age is going to continue to grow. Going to 2100, we expect it to be around 42 years. And this is basically where Europe is at today. So if you think of traveling through Europe, and if you think of the population distribution there, that's going to be the entire world, in the future, right? Because obviously, in developed economies, we're having fewer children, we're living longer. All of these little trends all correspond into that. I think the easier way to think about this is what we have on the bottom chart, which is simply that if you think of 65 as the retirement age, and of course, based on what we see in this chapter, like 65 might not be a great retirement age anymore. But that said, that's the traditional age that we think of as retirement age. That population is actually more than doubling in just 30 years. So we're going from 703 million people at retirement age right now to in 2050 to 1.55 billion. And of course, when you think about the amount of people on the planet, that is a significant chunk and a significant percentage increase in terms of who is in that demographic.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've got some questions around kind of what that means for pension savings and kind of how the retirement population around the world are going to be able to live, and kind of how we can effectively support them, or how we'll actually struggle to effectively support them, I guess is the more pertinent point. So after all, we're an investing podcast, and in terms of longevity, it's an investment theme that I think's been targeted by a lot of sort of fund houses and ETF providers along the way. There are investment products that offer exposure to this sort of thing, but I think what a lot of investors listening in will want to know is, how do you suppose people might gain investment exposure to this longevity trend? For example, do you see investors pouring capital into healthcare, elderly care, biotechnology, pharma, that sort of stuff?
So I think of this from two different angles. I think of, yes, there are obviously different areas that I think are super interesting from an investment angle. If you think about this 65 plus population that's going to be more than doubling over the next 30 years. If you think of people in that demographic, they're going to be wanting the same things that they're getting wealthier. They're going to be wanting the same level of care or better that people are getting today. But there's going to be way more money there, right? And there's going to continue to be way more money there. So when you look at things like the advances that you can make through, as you mentioned, things like biotech and things like that, there's going to be a huge market there that didn't necessarily exist before. There was that population before, but it was in dollar terms and number of people, it was much smaller. Now it's going to be much more mainstream, and so. One of the descriptions of this is the silver economy. So it's something that's expected to be, $15 trillion. All of the care and anything else that we're doing for this segment. But I also think about the risks. Like as an investor, obviously you have to be aware of where the opportunities are, but you also have to be aware of the risks. And this is a very this particular signal factors into everything, and and an aging population, and when you have fewer young people that are able to support that population, that has a huge ripple effect as well. So I would encourage people not to only think about things in terms of the opportunities that are presented from these signals in the book, but also what are the potential risks for my portfolio based on something like this, right? If the world is getting older, and that's something that we can't stop, and we know is going to continue to happen, and we know that there's going to be fewer younger people supporting them, what does that mean for the market, right? That obviously translates in a bunch of different ways, but certainly there are a bunch of risks there.
Yeah, absolutely, and probably not a point that gets brought up enough. So really good point, I think. So this is the retirement gap I mentioned earlier, that shortfall in pension savings that we're likely to experience, very neatly pictured and depicted here. Perhaps you can just talk us through here. I mean, this stuck out to me as a pretty alarming stat. So perhaps you can just talk us through the potential impact of this.
Absolutely. So, I think that the graphic is pretty straightforward here in showing the difference, but it might just be worth talking about, where does that difference arise, right? And so this is essentially the gap between what is potentially what is funding these pension programs and retirement versus what is actually needed to pay out. So as people are living longer but continuing to retire at the same age, and as you have fewer workers paying into the system, this is the kind of trend that materializes. And the World Economic Forum wrote about it about a couple of years back, and they actually called this akin to financial climate change, which is a really big label, obviously. But I do think it's a huge problem to consider, and this really is one of the risks that we when I'm talking about a signal providing both opportunities and risks, this is a risk, and it's a really hard thing to solve, right? Because obviously people that have come through these pension programs, they've been promised something, and it's in the writing that this is what they get out of it. But then how do you make up these shortfalls, right? So this really is a big challenge that is occurring as a result of an aging population, and it's going to be really interesting to see how it plays out and how governments around the world make decisions around solving it.
Yeah, also alarming kind of how much we don't necessarily hear about this. I mean, everyone's, I think, semi-aware of it, particularly within the financial world that we're both in to some extent, but kind of what initiatives and policies are being taken into account now and actually enacted now to actually counteract this, I'm not necessarily aware of many in the UK to tackle this. I don't know about you in sort of the US and Canada.
Yeah, and I would also say that this falls into the category of because it's happening slow and steady, again, the financial climate change analogy.
Yeah.
It's one of the hard things, where governments that are elected on, short 4-year terms or whatever, like they're not necessarily motivated to solve it because they're thinking this is kind of something that's going to be passed on to the guy after me, right? So yeah. From that incentives point of view, it's also really hard to until we start to see problems arise from this, like very obvious problems. For example, a pension is really having trouble paying its members and it's defaulting or something like that, or I don't know what that case might be, but as soon as you start to see that stuff happen, then it might, when it's too late, obviously that's when they're going to do something about it. But but up until that point, it's hard because there's obviously many other pressing problems in the world that need solving now as well. So yeah, it's kind of the greasy tire, gets the oil, right? Or whatever that analogy is.
Yeah, no, I know what you mean. And I think that's where the climate change analogy holds pretty strong as well. That election cycle of 4 years here and in the US as well means that it's never going to be prioritized because it's not something that's going to necessarily win them the election. So completely take your point, pretty grim reading. But let's get back to some of the other trends that you've mentioned within the book. So the next sub-theme I want to talk about is urban evolution. this, I guess, digs into sort of that max exodus that we're seeing across the globe, really, from rural areas, both kind of in surrounding sort of areas around cities, but further out as well, coming into the cities. And that seems to be taking place across the globe, as I say. Why, first of all, is that? Why are people moving kind of from agricultural-based lives into city life?
Yeah, so for the same reason that that I live in a city, or that you, I'm guessing, most likely are living in a city, everybody else wants to do the same, right? Everybody in Africa or India or China, they are, they want to go and be with a bunch of like-minded people. They want to be where the action is. They want the jobs. They want the potential earning that is occurring there. And so this is another one of these trends that are have been occurring for a really long time. I mean, in particular, this trend has been occurring since the agricultural revolution. As soon as we were able to have better farming outputs for fewer inputs, people realized that we didn't need to spend all day tending the fields, and they started to do other things. And in cities is where wealth creation happens. It's estimated that about 80% of global GDP comes from cities. So, when you compare that to the amount of population that's living in cities, which is actually less, it's about 56% right now globally. You see that's where the money is, and that's where the opportunity lies. So, everybody wants to be a part of that opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. And that trend, I guess, is quickening in terms of momentum, it seems, and that's something that's referenced in the book. So what's that urban to rural dispersion going to look like, if we look ahead to 2050, for example? Is that divergence going to be even greater?
Right. So today, it's 56% of the population lives in urban areas. And when you go to 2050, I think we're getting up to about 70% of the population. And I think when they project it out, I'm not 100% sure on this exact point, but it's looking closer to 80% by the end of the century. So, that's a lot of people living in very concentrated areas. When you think about the global population in 2050 or 2100, estimates right now are saying that there's going to be 10 to 11 billion people at those times. That's a lot of population living in cities.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess with that, the areas that those people are going to live in will need to grow. But the book actually references a kind of new cohort of cities that are to replace today's largest cities. So first of all, just for people that obviously haven't read the book, which cities are likely to be in that new cohort? Is it ones that we wouldn't necessarily expect, for example, and what regions are they likely to come from?
Yeah, so the cities of tomorrow are definitely not the cities of today. When you think of big cities today, you think of places like Tokyo or New York or London. But also, if you've been to any of those places, you also realize that those places don't necessarily have the momentum or ability to expand to the size that some of these new cities are expected to go to. So. We found a couple of really interesting data sets around this, but the very short answer is that if you're looking at the top 20 cities in either 2050 or going forward to something like 2100, it's expected that pretty much all of the world's biggest cities are going to be in Africa and India. None of them are going to be in North America or Europe. None of them are going to be in China, which is also really interesting. That's surprising. Which that actually ties into China's demographics, right? Which is that they had the one-child policy and so on. And so China's overall population is actually expected to start decreasing relatively soon. But India and Africa are really where those cities are going to be. And it's going to be places like Kinshasa or Lagos. And some of these are expected to be, there are projections out there that have them becoming 80 to 90 million people cities by the end of the century, which in our conventional lens of like what you and I think of as a city seems insane, but also these places have massive momentum. There's already there's already 200 million people in Nigeria, for example, and they all want to be in Lagos. So, and the growth rate of the population there is high enough that, what's stopping them? There's going to be that continual momentum for the next while. So it's a super interesting topic.
Yeah, really interesting. And I guess I want to link it back briefly to climate change. I mean, this increased urbanization is likely, obviously, to heap extra pressure on an already deteriorating climate. Where are we seeing that the most? I remember reading in the book there were kind of significant changes to certain climates within certain regions already as a result of this trend.
Yeah, so the most notable example, sorry, the most notable example is Jakarta in Indonesia, which is right now, I think it's like sinking 10 inches. I'm not sure if it's every year or if it's every so many periods, but it's obviously a giant city. And right now they're in the process of relocating the capital to somewhere else because they're realizing that this is not something that's going to be sustainable. So where we build these cities and how we build them and how we think about doing this is going to be really important, especially when you think of the size and the sheer scope of some of these cities, right? You don't want to make a mistake in where you place a 90 million person city. Right. And obviously, even the smallest mistake there or the smallest, disaster or something like that can be extremely impactful.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, a couple more questions on this, and then we'll move on to our final sub-theme. The first one being, of course, we're an investment podcast, so I want to try and link it back to kind of the investment exposure that people might try and kind of gain from this. And I guess one, not negative, at least neutral and maybe even positive trend kind of within this theme is smart cities. So the creation of smarter connected cities and the necessary infrastructure that would go with the construction of those cities. And a lot, again, of fund houses, ETF houses have built products to give retail and institutional investors exposure to that sort of thing. How compelling, in your opinion, is the kind of smartness or the increased connectivity of cities as an investment trend to you?
Well, as a long-term trend, I think it's extremely valid. The amount of, as we mentioned, cities are going to become even more important than they are today. And they're going to continue to be the centers of wealth. And there's going to be more and more data in each city that's starting to be created and that can be taken advantage of. And that cities will spend money on these things and they will want to have them. And once they're all working together, it can create a big impact. I think the challenge is with a lot of these things is that it takes time. It's not something that can be done overnight. And it's these obviously municipal governments and sometimes higher level, either state or federal governments are also involved in these types of exercises. And so infrastructure takes time. And so over a long time horizon, I mean, I think it's super interesting. It's just not something that, we've been hearing about smart cities for years, but have we necessarily seen the action and results over that period of time? Like, I'm not sure of that. I think there are some examples of some emerging smart cities out there, but I don't think there's anything where you go there and you're like, oh, wow, like everything is automated and they're taking data from everything to make better decisions. And it's clearly, generating billions of dollars of extra output or something like that. So I think there's still a ways to go.
Yeah, completely agree. Okay, so the final question on this section is one where I think we can reference the infographic again. And that's in relation to kind of the dispersion and the situation of some of these new cities. So here we're going to talk about very briefly the kind of distribution, as I say, of these cities and the population within them. And the book references a really interesting sort of trend and phenomenon, which is the clustering effect. So perhaps you can briefly explain that to the listeners.
Yeah, so as countries become more urbanized, meaning that more people are living in cities within them, they tend not to move to separately like cities that are far from each other, they actually tend to cluster in certain mega regions. So if you go to a place like, China is a great example of this with the Pearl River Delta, which you can see in the just under the clustering effect thing here. You have Hong Kong, Shenzhen, and all of these cities all around this one region. And of course, in the US, there's a couple of really good examples of this too. The most notable is the Northeast Corridor, where you can go from Boston all the way to Washington, D.C. And as you go through there, you're passing through New York City and Philly and Baltimore and all these places. And so just within a few hours of each other, you have many different but also connected cities that complement each other in certain ways. And again, if you look in the Northeast Corridor in the US, you have New York, which is obviously the financial and media center. You have Boston, which is loosely categorized. You have Harvard and MIT and all these things there. You have amazing pharma and all those kind of industries based there. And then you have DC, which is the government center. And so all of these they have different specializations, but they all work together in this really interesting way. And it creates a really powerful network effect in these places where they create value. But yeah, this is just a trend that tends to occur for various reasons as cities or as countries become more urbanized.
Yeah, great. And I guess the book's saying that not only does this trend occur, but it will occur with increasing frequency as populations grow. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. And so again, if we go back to our big megacities that we're talking about that are developing in places like India and Africa, certainly some of these mega regions are already starting to grow. If you look at, for example, in I think Southeast Africa is a good example of this, with Dar es Salaam and Nairobi, and you can start to see pockets where there's going to be really big cities in the future that are pretty close to one another. But that said, there's also an aspect of it that hasn't occurred yet, which is that when you go to, like, as a person that's moving from a rural area to an urban area, do you want to move into the middle of a 20 million person city, or do you just want to be close by to that city? And then you move into a separate city that is close and kind of like a suburb, right? That is, it's nice right now, but it's not, you're not in the middle of the chaos. Well, a bunch of other people also want to do the same thing, and they will move to that same place, and then that will become a city in itself. So it's that kind of effect that creates these clusters. But it obviously already helps to have a couple of anchor cities in that area to begin with. But yeah, we're going to start to see more of these regions that are interconnected, that have different specializations in each place, that start to pop up.
So finally, the book talks about the rise of the middle class, I guess, and by that we mean fewer people living in poverty, than ever before. The book references, at least. So, was there a tipping point at which global sort of socioeconomic disparity started to equalize? And if so, what trends were inciting that equalization?
So this is a really interesting topic, because before I get into your question, I think it's also worth pointing out that there is a trend that seems like it's the opposite of this trend that we also cover in the book, which is the rise of inequality within countries. And I find that two are super interesting combined, because you have within a country, you have increasing inequality. In most developed countries, this is something that's occurring. But then when you look outside of that individual country, globally, the population is becoming richer and they're coming out of poverty, and the global middle class is going to be growing super fast. So these two things are kind of contradictory, but also it makes sense when you think about them in unison. But to your question, as far as when that tipping point occurred, really the biggest single thing is China emerging in the 1990s and 2000s. When that process started, I mean, obviously it's a country with 1.4 billion people. ton of those people were living as farmers, and their income level was in the lower end of that spectrum. Many of them in poverty, hundreds of millions, in fact. And the single biggest driver of this entire trend is China emerging and starting to spread that wealth around with those hundreds of millions of people. And obviously, this is something that's well documented and that has been covered a lot. But it's about China opening up its economy to having those regions that can take investment and building factories and industrializing and having jobs for those farmers to go to that pay better. And then once you add that all together over that period of 10 to 20 years, it makes a huge impact in terms of the amount of people in poverty. And just because China is so big, it really moves the needle. But that said, it's also that's like an extreme example of what's happening globally in other countries too, right?
Yeah.
If you look at the other countries that are, the world's, factories or things like that, if you places like Vietnam or some of these other countries that are developing and starting to move from agricultural to more industrial economies, the same things are happening in those places as well.
Yeah, and I guess my first thought as an investor, I suppose, is to kind of look at consumer behavior, because I guess with the rising middle class, there's more disposable income available to certain people and families as a whole, and therefore they might start buying different things, or at least buying more things in general. Where are we seeing that? Are we seeing increased spending in discretionary goods? Have you noticed anything there? And does the book talk about that?
Yeah, so I think China is a great example here, because there's so many people that have income that they've never had before. They're obviously starting to make purchase decisions that they also haven't had to make before. Mm-hmm. And I think what's really interesting about it is that because there's less of a precedent of people having wealth in these places, they, based on their culture and based on this time and place, mm-hmm. they're choosing to put their money in probably different things than we would have done at the same time, right? And so spending patterns are different. They're the same in some ways, right? I mean, people want to have a car or a means of transportation, or people want to buy nicer things. They want to eventually buy some sort of a luxury good. So those things are the same, but the allocations towards them is not necessarily the same, and it depends on the place, and it depends on the person involved, and that data is super interesting to look at as well.
Yeah, massively so. Okay, so we're coming towards the end of the session. So my penultimate question is about the movement between these kind of economic classes. It does seem to differ pretty wildly. I read that every second, on average, only 0.5 people from the middle class graduate to the upper class, whereas when you compare that to the lower to middle class, it's actually 5 people that make that same graduation. So what's preventing that transfer to the upper echelons of society and the economy?
Yeah, this is a really great question. And I think it's something that is sort of the next thing that you need to look at in this entire signal, which is, okay, we have a bunch of people moving out of poverty, which is obviously great, but they're still not middle class in the way that we think of them, or definitely in the global upper class. So it's worth thinking about how these things are defined firstly. So the global upper class, the way it's defined in the book, and when you talk, or when you're looking at these different sources that cover this thing, they basically say earning about $110 a day is what puts you into the global upper class. So when you think of that in those terms, most people that are in the middle class in the United States or in the UK or so on, they're considered global upper class in this situation, right? So how do we get people into what we consider middle class, right? That's really what we're asking. And when you think of it in those terms, I think it's I think you have to look at where they are right now. And so this big bubble of people that have moved out of poverty are now in the or moving into the global middle class. That's not our middle class. These are people working in factories, people that are doing, non-knowledge work, and they're making more money than they've ever made before, but it's still not up to this other standard. So what does it take to get up into what we consider middle class? Well, a lot of time that means there has to be that knowledge work component to it. You have to be able to create much more value in like a leveraged way, where you do something and it creates much more value than the input that you've put in. That's when someone can really pay you that amount of money, right? And when you're just working in a factory or in some other type of commoditized type of work, for example, as someone who is cleaning in China, or they're or maybe even a teacher, right? These things are not quite up to providing that global middle class, or global upper class level. So yeah, I mean, obviously the countries have to be richer as a whole. They have to have more wealth as a whole, but also they have to have more people in positions where they're able to create that value and get that income. So yeah, it's just a math game, right? It's easier to have people to provide new jobs for people that are coming into factories and so on. It's harder to say, hey, we need you to have a university degree or whatever that equivalent is, and you need to be coming up, making decisions and things that are adding a ton of value to society, right? That type of knowledge work is harder to just flip a switch and have people do that. So I think that's really the next step is, you're starting to see more engineers, you're starting to see more business people emerge out of these different places, and those are the people that are going to be moving into that income class.
Yeah, fantastic. I think just to, as a final question, so I guess to make it a bit less abstract and to really bring home kind of what we mean by, or what you guys mean in the book by upper class and middle class, because I think it does sort of diverge with what people naturally think of those sorts of things, is again returning to sort of consumption trends and kind of trying to depict, I suppose, where this rising middle class are actually spending their money. So let's just reference another infographic to bring that message home now. So here we've got this depiction of increased consumption trends from within the middle class, and you've broken it down by region. And I think it's interesting that when you think of the middle class, you might think more about discretionary and luxury goods like we were talking about earlier, but actually, to be able to buy meat and to be able to spend money on education is the sort of thing that we're talking about here. So perhaps you can just break this infographic down for us.
Yeah, so I think that meat is an example of a good that I think, which is, I mean, a topic in itself because of the rise of meatless meat, and it's something else that we cover in the book. But traditionally, meat has been something that is expensive, and people in the lower classes of society haven't had as much access to as they've wanted. Of course, it would be great to have a steak every Friday night, but when you're in the lower or lower middle class, that's not possible. So what we see just through the data is that as people become richer, their consumption of something like meat goes up extraordinarily. You can see on the graph there that it's almost a completely linear trend, in that places like the US and Israel and Canada, which are some of the wealthier places on earth, their meat consumption is on average a lot higher than the global average. And then on the same point, the places that are on the lower ends of the GDP per capita spectrum are not consuming as much. So that's one example of this is a really clear example, I think, but that also applies to a bunch of other categories. And the way that we started to look at this was just looking on the right part of the screen here. We looked at how even US household spending has changed just in the period of about 40 years. And over those 40 years, again, even though we're looking at a developed country in the US, people have still gotten wealthier over that period of time on average. And so as a result of that, how they have chosen to spend their money has also changed. And then, of course, this is a function of prices and things like that too, right? But what you can see is that, people eat at home less, they want to eat out more. And you can see that when you look at something like health, health becomes paramount because even though there's obviously inflation happening there as well, I think in healthcare, I think also that, it's kind of like a Maslow's hierarchy type thing, right? Where as soon as you are out of an environment where you're just struggling to make ends meet, you start to care about the sort of the bigger things in life, like can I stay healthy for a long period of time, and how can I make sure that I'm able to spend that quality time with family and things like that. So yeah, recreation, education, health spending is going up. And then on the bottom here, this goes back to the point that I was making before, which is that how we spend money really depends on where we are and the society that you live in. And the way that, for example, Americans are spending their money, their disposable income, is different from how someone in the middle class in China or India or these other places is going to spend their money. And that's why it's important not to paint everything with the same brush and say that more people in the middle class means more X. I think it's different. It's different in each market, right? How people are choosing to spend their money. But yeah, you can see here that certain categories are much more important for these different groups. So that's worth noting as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's been really fantastic to talk to you. So to end, I suppose, where can people get the book? I assume just on all sort of major online stores.
Yeah, it's published through Wiley, and it's available through a number of different places, but obviously something like Amazon is the easiest for most people.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll post that Amazon link in the episode description as well. And that just leaves me to say thank you very much for joining us, Jeff. It's been a real pleasure.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening, everyone. Just a quick note before we sign off. If you're looking for an easily digestible daily update on the markets, this might be of interest. Opto Updates is our short newsletter sent every day during the trading week, giving you a bulleted list of the top 7 stories from the global stock markets. We've done the hard work for you, highlighting relevant opportunities and trends, and in addition, we'll also keep you notified of any new products, stock reports, or webinars from the Opto world. If you're interested, sign up using the link in the show notes. And thanks also to Co-Fruition for consulting on and producing the show. Until next time.